It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Nikhil Josh. Nikhil and I work together as Agile coaches and consultants at Adaptivate here in Toronto. He has experience implementing Agile and digital transformations across different industries. And this includes implementing OKRs, which is his passion, about coaching, capability building, and metrics and reporting for leadership. He possesses a passion for leading change and sustained transformation in complex environments. So welcome, Nikhil. And now over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen. That was a very warm welcome. And thank you all for joining me on my passionate OKR chat today. So without further ado, let's hop right into it. If I were to think about what I'd like all of you to walk away with just before we jump right in, it's just a high-level teaser in terms of what OKRs are, where they came from, why use them, and to some degree, how to write good OKRs. Now, there's a lot more depth in this concept, so hopefully maybe we'll get a chance to chat about it at some point, either through the question and answers, or my information will be on the page at the end, so feel free to reach out and I can talk OKRs for days. So without further ado, let's talk about OKRs a little bit. So I'm going to kick things off with a little bit of the history of OKRs. It really started at Intel. Now, Andy Grove, the CEO at the time, back in the late 60s, brought this framework in. And what he basically did is he took Peter Drucker, founding father of some of the more modern day management principles, and of course, management by objectives. He took MBO and built out an OKR framework to be more aspirational. And he essentially took Intel from a point of challenging times, if you will, with a lot of pressure from competitors into the success that it was back then, and I guess to some degree today. Shortly after that, John Doerr came along and joined Intel and eventually climbed the ranks and became an executive there. And he really started preaching the good word of OKRs, if you will. And he was actually the one that took it to Google in their early days. John is also a VC or venture capitalist. So he does impart the OKR wisdom on a lot of the startups that he does work with. Once Google picked it up, they obviously grew, and OKRs are actually a foundational piece for a lot of their products, such as Google Search, Chrome, Android, Maps, the list goes on. And of course, OKR started growing in popularity over the last 20-ish years, or 10, 15 years, I guess. Keep forgetting what year we're in now. And with that, and John put out a book, and that really drove some of that interest. And we'll talk about the book towards the end as well. All right, so what are they? Let's jump right into it. OKR stands for Objectives and Key Results. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this term and heard it both within industry or just all over the place. I think everybody's buzzing about this term. So what really is it? Well, it's really a framework. And I stress framework because it's not meant to be prescriptive. There's no major guardrails governing it. It's really there to enable success. And it's both used for organizational as well as individual objectives. And you have these key results that are able to track how you progress against those objectives. Just looking at that, I do want to call out that I myself have used it as an individual objective, in addition to helping organizations adopt it at the organizational level. So very useful all across the board. Objectives in this case are really the what and the where you're trying to end up. The key results are going to indicate how you measure progress against said objectives. Typically, and we'll talk about this a little bit, there's a slide on this, the cadence for OKRs are set on either an annual and or quarterly basis. So sometimes you set it an annual basis and you can set quarterly mini objectives against that larger objectives, and so on and so forth with key results. This is usually set during what's known as a quarterly business review process or an annual business review process. So why? Let's talk about why OKRs. OKRs are, if I was to distill it down to three things, it's inspirational, it helps enable focus, and of course, the most important, helps you execute. From an inspirational perspective, OKRs are meant to be that rally cry for teams, for an organization. It helps engage everybody in an organization. Because it's ambitious, you want it to instill that intrinsic motivation for people who are at all levels of the organization to be able to drive that progress and drive the organization forward. I'm going to use Norman Van Peel's quote in terms of, if you shoot for the stars or shoot for Mars, I guess, at the very least, you'll land on the moon. And that's really where the OKRs really hit its stride in terms of inspiring and rallying people. And you'll see that with some of the examples later on. From a focus perspective, you want it to be as clear as possible. And beyond that, OKRs, if effectively introduced, does provide that level of focus because it's simple, it's easy, and it's to some degree specific. And the most important part, OKRs will help you execute a little better. As Andy Grove puts it, if you hit your OKRs, it should be a yes, no, it should be as simple as that. And I do want to go back to a quote from earlier. It doesn't really matter what you know, it matters how you execute, or execution matters most. And OKRs really help drive that forward. So objectives, they're achieved through key results, right? So an objective is typically ambitious. There's 3 to 5 objectives. That's kind of the optimal point. You want it to feel a little uncomfortable. You want to set it both at an annual and a quarterly basis. And of course, you want to make it as transparent as possible. From a key result perspective, you want to make it similar to an objective. You want to have about 3 to 5 key results per objective. They can follow the SMART framework, and I'm sure most of you know it. If not, it's specific, measurable, achievable or attainable, relevant, and time bound. And that's just the best practice. And of course, the key results really speak to the how we're measuring some of those elements. Cool. So let's dive into what good versus great looks like. I mean, average is mediocre, so let's go good versus great. If we start off with the average section, we talk about growing a company's e-commerce business. But the challenge here is that we're telling people how to do their jobs. We're telling them that it's going to be the development of apps and the increase in marketing that's going to drive that. Not really overly inspirational, right? Because ultimately you want to give that to the folks that are closest to the work, and you want to help inspire them to be the most successful that way. So if we jump into the next level down, yeah, it's pretty good. It's getting better. It's growing the number of customers on the company. It's outcome focused a little bit more, but we don't know the time period, nor do we know what does grow actually entail. So a good objective would be, doubling the number of e-commerce customers over the last year by the end of this year. We're not only being inspirational, it is action oriented, to some degree it's tangible. We can actually measure the number of customers, e-commerce customers that are on our platforms. And of course, it is time bound. Let's jump into, so that's the objectives. So if we were to pick 3 key results to tie up to said objective, we start off with an average one, which is launching a mobile app. It doesn't really have any kind of measurement associated to it, not really outcome oriented. Just because you launch an app doesn't mean that people are going to use it or buy anything off that app. But if you move through the chain and you look at a better key result, mobile app is available to customers. Great. But so what? You ask the question, why? Why is that important? Because it doesn't mean that you're buying anything. And then you take it one step further and you say the outcome of having the mobile app available to customers on the app stores enables them to purchase through said mobile app. So a good key result looks like having a measurable outcome, which is 25,000 customers, and it's time bound by saying we want it by November 2022. And not to mention, of course, it's actionable. I'm not going to cover all 3 key results. We can always come back to them in the questions section. OKRs cascading through an organization. So ideally, we briefly touched upon the concept of transparency. We want our OKRs to cascade through the organization, right from the senior leadership, right to any person working in an organization. Now, OKRs are typically set both ways. You set it at a strategic level, at an organizational level, but you want that input and feedback from all the people closest to the work. So having a two-way tie to create some of those OKRs really helps enable and focus the organization on the right objectives and the right key results. And we talked about review cycles very briefly. So ultimately, you want your OKRs, my favorite phrase, think annually, act quarterly. So you set your objectives and key results primarily on an annual basis. And then you can either set mini objectives and key results on a quarterly basis, or you can kind of break out your OKR and have them specific to a quarter. So let's say an objective is to have 100,000 customers purchase on your app. Your quarterly measures could be 25,000. Oh, sorry.
No.
I think I just got some feedback. 25,000 customers per quarter, and then that ties up to your 100,000 by the end of the year. So you want to have monthly check-ins as well, just as an added side bonus. That basically enables you to understand if you need to pivot. If your key results are not hitting the mark, having monthly check-ins will kind of enable you to pivot and reevaluate whether you pick the right key results or whether your objective needs to be tweaked slightly. Keep an open mind, and of course, progress takes time. Three main elements I will try to cover as quickly as possible as we get closer to the 15-minute mark. But these are very important. OKRs, in order for an OKR to be successful, it has to be more than just a framework, and it has to have more than just organizational buy-in. The first element that needs to be present is psychological safety. OKRs are not meant to be performance frameworks. They're not meant to be a measure of individual performance, and they should be 100% transparent. If not, you're not going to write OKRs. You're basically going to be writing objectives or KPIs that you're looking to drive forward, and you always have to hit 100%. You're not going to be stretching. You're not going to be ambitious. Business agility is the second element. So this is a chicken and egg thing. Business agility needs to be present before OKRs can be truly wholly implemented. But the flip side of that is OKRs enable further business agility. And that's something to keep in mind because it allows organizations to pivot as needed and drive some of those larger goals forward. And lastly, the value mindset. A lot of organizations, especially more traditional ones, still stick on outputs over outcomes. How much can we deliver rather than what are we really delivering? And how are we really moving the needle in terms of what we want to get to or where we want to get to? So it also takes away that focus towards value instead of purely time, cost, and scope. If some of these elements are not present, it does create a very complex environment for implementing OKRs. And of course, what presentation would not be complete without some resources? So a famous book, I did talk about John quite a bit, but John Doerr's book, Measure What Matters, is kind of the go-to spot if you want to learn about OKRs. He's got great examples, very simple to read, and you can basically power through it on a weekend. Radical Focus is the other book that's fairly new to my bookshelf, and I've been enjoying it quite a bit too. Very simple text as well. I would read John Doerr first before you start Radical Focus. And of course, if you have any questions regarding OKRs, feel free to reach out to myself. My email's on the screen, and just chat with me on LinkedIn. I'd be more than happy to chat OKRs with you. And with that, I think we're just coming up on time.
Yeah, well done, Nikhil. You came in well under time, actually. So a couple of questions have already come in through the chat. Some people have sent me questions already. So folks, for those of you new to AgileTO, welcome. Feel free to post questions in the chat, post them directly to me, post them publicly, or just let me know if you have a question that you want to ask. Nikhil, there were a few people, though, both in the public chat and who sent me a note in behind, just asking if you had more examples that you could share. Like that one was
Absolutely.
Good. Could you dive into a couple of other examples, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the appendix, so these are actual company OKRs that I actually pulled. So Measure What Matters, the book. They've got a coinciding website. It's whatmatters.com. It's a great resource, and with great examples. So I pulled a few that actual companies have been using, and I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to kind of read through it. But now, if you look at there is a good variance in terms of what type of company. So Snap Inc., for example, is super tech-focused, very forefront-esque. And I think it's definitely targeted to our younger generation, because if you read their objective, it's really invest in the root if you want the fruit. So I wouldn't say that that's an optimal objective if you're starting out with OKRs. Google has a more normalized objective around increasing sales. But I think it all depends on the maturity curve of where you are in terms of adopting OKRs and how well your organization can kind of rally behind some of those key results.
Cool, good examples. You talked a little bit about them connecting down to teams and sort of inspiring. Can you talk maybe a little bit more about the hierarchy and where there's a breakdown between where an objective is and a key result is? Like, do we set one for our company, or do we set one for our department, or how do these break down?
Sure. Let me just go back a slide. So this is a good example that I kind of threw together for the purposes of speaking to cascading. If we think about OKRs as a whole, you want your North Star for adopting OKRs in an effective manner is to have a two-way conversation. Both you set objectives and key results at leadership level and up at the top, and you have kind of the conversation at the squad or tribe level OKRs, right down to the members within those squads. And then you want to be able to melt the gap together. So you want to share across between leadership and the squads, because the squads are closest to the work. Based on that, you can come together and come up with your OKRs. So assume a perfect scenario where that conversation has taken place. Your objective will start at maybe something larger scale at an organizational level where we talk about increasing revenue. And so if we were to just follow out one example, and this kind of ties back to the example we chatted about earlier, then one of the key results ends up being double the number of e-commerce customers over last year by December 2022. Great. Again, it's a little high level. So maybe a business unit, maybe the digital area might pick it up and say, okay, this key result is now going to be my objective. And if we create our own set of key results, then that ties further down to an individual squad. So if we look at the objective at the business level, they've got a key result around 23,000 customers purchasing through the app. We take that to the squad level. Great, that's their North Star that they're going to be focused on for the year. And then they'll come up with their own set of key results that will help them focus in on how to measure success towards that objective. So 100,000 downloads, for example. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
So if I'm following this correctly, when I look at strategic OKRs of doubling the number of e-commerce customers, I assume that means people purchasing, and I break that down into the business OKR of 23,000 customers purchasing, there might be another one for my marketing team, for example, to drive increased traffic to my platform, or my advertising to drive awareness, or those types of things, right? All connected to that same one. Is that where you're getting at with this?
It would be. Sorry, are you talking about connecting back up to the strategic OKR?
Yeah.
100%. Actually, funny enough, that is true. That was actually my next point, which is awesome. So if I were to look at achieve a click-through rate of 2% by September 2022, let's look at a business OKR. That would end up being potentially part of a marketing function if that's how the organization's set out. Now, in all fairness, if your teams are truly cross-functional, you may have some embedded marketing folk within your squads. And then that achieve a click-through rate of 2% might actually be a squad level OKR, depending on which way you're structuring and your capabilities within your squad or your tribe. That being said, yes, if there's a marketing campaign that you want to tie up to a key result, absolutely, a function's going to pick that up and roll with that. And a key result at the business level could also feed both the squad as well as a marketing function. That could happen too.
So it really is about the conversation, as you were talking about, and getting that alignment. Now, yes. I heard you say something a moment ago about individuals and this being used for teams and squads and businesses and organization. But I'm wondering, how do you use these for like setting individual performance goals and then individual performance management of the resources on my team?
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned earlier, OKRs are not meant to be a performance based measure. They're really for the organization to drive progress towards big, ambitious goals. Your performance measures for your individual squad members are a completely separate conversation. Maybe a developer wants to move up in the development career framework, right? So that developer can set a separate objective, but it's not tied to any of these ambitions. So, for example, if the individual squad does not hit the 23,000 customers purchased through the mobile app, that should not tie back down to said developer's work. That developer may be like, oh, maybe I contributed to that to some degree, but that's a completely different conversation. That's more of an introspective conversation between the developer and him or herself. Ideally, you want to separate your OKRs from your individual performance measures from a individual and a direct line manager perspective. So, for example, another example could be, a developer would want to take or set a goal to upskill or cross-skill, right? There's no specific tie, even though it does benefit the overarching organization. There's no specific tie to an OKR. And then the last piece of that is you don't want to be holding people accountable for some of these OKRs, because again, it takes away from that psychological safety that I talked about earlier. And if psychological safety is not present, you can't be ambitious, unfortunately.
Okay, so these examples are great. They're all very business and outcome driven. I get that. I mean, that's the point of it. How do you use OKRs to measure like intangible things like learning?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Coursera does it to some degree. Well, I guess it's more so Reach. But if we set a learning objective of, let me think here. I need to grow my skill sets in, coding. Okay, so that's a business function. I need to get my MBA. Let's say that. Let me say it's a personal learning objective. I need to get my MBA by 2025. Okay, great. So now I'm going to have key results that are going to basically mark up, and maybe each year I'll have an objective or key result that's tying to that ultimate North Star. I know objectives and key results are typically set annually, but sometimes you could have that North Star that you want to get to. And so this year I'm going to focus on maybe beefing up my resume. So what that means is, take on or grow in X number of areas. So you want it to be measurable, and you want to be able to time box it by the end of this year. Maybe the second piece is you network with people within a specific MBA program, so that you're not just a paper or a name on a pile. And then you can start to build those elements into it. It all just depends on how you want to structure that goal and where you want to get to from an outcome focus. So even learning is an outcome. You're gaining some knowledge, you're gaining something out of it, and you're able to apply that knowledge. So it's just framing up your OKR to be able to speak to that outcome of framing that knowledge.
What do you do when people are not hitting their key results on a quarterly basis?
Great question. So what you'd like to do is just run a retrospective, understand what's going on. Sometimes key results may have a little bit of a delayed effect. So you can't always just shut the door and say, that's it, we got to pivot from there. But that conversation is meant to stimulate those questions. So why? Well, maybe it's we're not doing the right things to drive a key result forward. So in my earlier example, let's say we're not able to achieve a click-through rate of 2% by September 2022. This one over here. So why? We're basically October, our click-through rate is 0.1%. So maybe we're not hitting it because our marketing campaigns aren't strong enough. Maybe our links or however we're driving people to our sites or our mobile app aren't strong enough. So maybe we need to spend more time building better icons, more attractive icons. So you have those conversations to really dive down to the root cause of the problem. Sometimes it could be a seasonal thing, right? Maybe people don't buy our products at a point in time in a year. Well, we should have factored that in. So maybe September 22 is not reasonable. Maybe we should have done it by December because maybe it's winter coats, for example, and that's all we sell. So it's just conversations that are going to have to take place to be able to understand really why we're not hitting those key results. Then we decide whether we want to keep the key result, we want to edit the key result, or we want to remove the key result altogether. I'm not saying that just because we don't hit a key result, we remove it. We have to have very good reasoning in terms of why we're pivoting and how it impacts our overarching business model as well.
It sounds like a kind of conversation that I'd rather avoid, this whole why didn't you hit your OKR? What prevents teams, pods, squads, groups, business units from simply sandbagging and setting really easy to hit OKRs? I guess setting really easy to hit KRs.
Wonderful question. So ideally in when you set OKRs, as I mentioned earlier, they have to be uncomfortable, which means we're stretching. Ideally, you want to be able to hit 70% of your objective and key results. So that to me says that that 30% buffer you built in is your stretch goal. And you may not even have hit the 70% had you had set the cap at 70% of that objective or key result. So like I said, if you hit between 60 to 70% of a key result and therefore potentially 60 and 70% of your objective, that means you're stretching and trying to get to that point. So you always want to build in that extra buffer of, I'm going to try my hardest, I'm going to see where it goes, and we're going to do the right things to get there. The second piece around that, again, comes back to the psychological safety element. Your organization should foster that level of psychological safety, and individuals should not be held accountable because, again, this is not a performance framework. This is an organizational step forward to try to move everybody in that same direction. So as an organization, you have a conversation and you retrospectively look at if you didn't hit something, why is that? And again, it comes back to the previous conversation. But yes, to summarize that, 60 to 70%, trying to hit that, that's your optimal point.
This sounds like there's a lot of connections that a couple of folks actually are hearing and making comments about. This sounds like new branding on key performance indicators. How is this connected or not to KPIs? Yes,
the fun question that we often get asked. So I would distill it down into three primary elements. I'm sorry. The difference between OKRs and KPIs, I'd say one is OKRs are meant to be ambitious, KPIs not necessarily. Number two is OKRs also meant to be more transparent. KPIs can be siloed, and I'll dive into these examples a little bit more. And the last piece is the time element. to OKRs versus KPIs. Looking at the first one, like we talked about, your goal in this case is really to potentially hit 60 to 70% of said OKR. You're really stretching for that. A key performance indicator is really an operational metric. It can be a health metric. For any agilists on the call, your percentage story points completed to committed could be a KPI specifically for that squad, not meant to be shared across. And I have to draw that out because we get that question followed up. And then the second piece, which it kind of drives, is that siloed versus broad scale or transparent, that transparency that comes with OKRs. So for example, let's look at the velocity metric. That's really within the squad. So it's siloed within that squad's performance indicator. Another measure could be number of outage minutes. Again, a technical measure, very much siloed within potential enterprise infrastructure. Marketing team might have a siloed metric around click-through rates. Again, I mean, although this is an OKR because we're stretching to get to that point, click-through rate as a measure might only be an operational metric within a specific team. Versus OKRs are more transparent. Everybody should have access to OKRs. You can clearly see the tie-up, and it should be very transparent because we're really stretching and we're trying to get to that forefront. And of course, the last piece, KPIs from time to time tend to be a year over year. They keep running year over year. For example, your outage metrics is something that you measure year over year to ensure that whatever you're putting out there, it's not creating more challenges and taking your environments down from a technical perspective. Versus OKRs are meant to be time boxed within either a quarter or a year. Yes, you may occasionally have, like in the real world, you probably have OKRs that run more than a year, but ultimately you want to keep it to a year. As we saw with the pandemic, things change, customer behavior changes. We have world events, political events that take place that changes the dynamic of consumers and buying behavior. So you don't, as an organization, you don't want to be left behind on that. So if your key performance indicator is saying everything is fine and dandy, but the whole world is changing around it and it may not get reflected in the KPI, we're not keeping that ambitious view on how we can get ahead of some of these challenges in the future. So that's kind of my takeaway. There's a million different things in terms of comparing KPIs versus OKRs, but those are my three main elements that I try to distill it down to.
Really cool. There's two questions that are actually opposite ends of the spectrum. So I'm going to give you both to you and okay, let you go on this one. The first one is, why do I have to wait for an entire quarter or an entire year to review my OKRs? Can't I review them more frequently? Mm-hmm. And then the second question of that came through the chat is, that's ridiculous. We don't deliver anything in a year. Compliance alone takes 8 months to review anything that we've done. Why are we trying to rush stuff through? So two opposite ends of the spectrum that have come through on these.
Great questions. So let's start with the first one. So in one of my slides above, I think I talk about you can perform monthly check-ins. It really depends on the cadence, right? If your squad is delivering outcomes and they're able to measure those outcomes based on the features being delivered, and again, I'm going back to a little bit of that product mindset. You can absolutely test it on or check your OKRs on even a bi-weekly cadence, right? It's totally up to you, but they're check-ins, right? At the end of the quarter is really when you want to do a full retrospective and you want to run through it. If your organization's nimble enough and agile enough to run it more frequently, go right ahead. There's nobody stopping you to do that. You just want to make sure you're actually able to see the value from some of these OKRs that you've set in place. I hope that answers the question around, can you do it more frequently? Without a doubt. To go to the other question around setting with compliance and things like that, great. So your compliance takes 8 months, and that's the only time you can actually review OKRs. That happens, right? Some of these OKRs that you've seen kind of come from the tech space, which is a little bit more nimble or a lot more nimble than some of the more established financial institutions that tend to have more compliance. What you want to do is you want to figure out how you can work within those frameworks. So yes, maybe an objective might take 8 months to deliver and you may not see value as frequently. That's okay. At least you're stepping in the right direction and you're still having that conversation at the outcomes. The second piece to that is when you run a retrospective and you understand, well, why didn't I hit that? Or why didn't I get there for 8 months? At least it institutes another conversation that comes up. Well, maybe there's something that we can do on the compliance front. Either maybe we don't have enough lawyers to review documentation. We only have one person doing that and it's sitting at a bottleneck, and heck, we got to move this forward. And so those are the kind of conversations you need to have, and maybe there's an opportunity to improve that. Now, of course, external compliance requirements, like government related or any kind of a governance body that sits outside the organization. Those are challenges that you'll have to work within, right? Unfortunately, within those confines. But within things that you can influence, try to set OKRs in such a manner.
Cool. Listen, we're just about at time. There are still a few questions, so if folks you're able to stick around, I'm going to go for another couple of minutes here and see if we can extract a little more knowledge out of Nikhil, because this is great and the questions are fast and furious. Understand if you have to drop off. This recording will be available on the AgileTO YouTube channel, probably in a couple of days. So if you do have to drop off and you want to see the last few minutes or tell your friends about it, feel free to send people to the AgileTO YouTube channel. The link is in the chat. But Nikhil, if you're good to keep going,
yes, absolutely.
I'd love to go a little bit more. You've talked about the connection between the strategic goal, the business unit goal, and then the squad or team or pod, depending on if we're Spotify or Google or if we want to pretend we are. Can I use OKRs in just a part of my organization, or do they really have to connect to all of the different layers in my org?
That's a good question, because I think some of the so let's start with an ideal state. Ideal state, you want to have that full tie up to an organizational goal, right? Because that helps you answer the why we're doing the work that we're doing. But I think a lot of organizations are faced with that exact question, because maybe at the more senior levels or broader organizational levels, they haven't started adopting OKRs. And so they're still in a more traditional, and maybe it's management by objectives framework. So yes, I would absolutely encourage your squads or your teams that you are, overseeing potentially. I'm going to use the typical bureaucratic term, but overseeing your squads, implement in that area, because what that does is it unlocks some form of an intrinsic motivator within the squads. The second piece is, as a leader, you may want to still articulate the problems that your teams are trying to solve. Even though you may not be able to, get the perfect tie up to the organization level, at least articulate that to your teams, because that again ties into that intrinsic motivator. And then the third piece is let them roll with it. Let your teams run with it. Let them be ambitious. Let them try. Let them experiment. Let them fail. Because what comes out of failure is learning opportunities, right? Within reason. I'm not saying break 30 systems to get one feature out the door. I'm talking about within reason. And start small. So if you start with smaller OKRs that maybe have lower risk, but at least get people thinking in that outcome mindset, that's super beneficial, even if the tie is broken somewhere down the line.
So interesting question that came through here. Why shouldn't a team use OKRs? I mean, you've given us all the reasons that someone should. Can you give me a time when someone shouldn't?
That's a good question. Now that's dumb. I can't think of I genuinely can't think of a scenario where, an OKR doesn't make sense. I think the closest to that might come to compliance, or if you have some external factor that's really preventing you from doing so. I think what that would really do is change your timelines more than actually impact the ability to do OKRs. All we're doing is we're just flipping the framework on its head and start thinking about the why we're doing what we're doing. So in any organization, in any part of the organization, there shouldn't be a reason why we are not asking the question why, right? So again, we're going from that output to that outcome thought process. So I'm stumped. I mean, if anybody on the call has seen a scenario where OKRs don't really make sense, I'd be happy to have an argument with you. Not argument, sir. A discussion with you around why OKRs might not be a good idea.
So maybe you'd be so kind as to throw your contact slide back up again, and if folks want to get in touch with you, I think there was a QR code that'll bring us to your LinkedIn profile.
Bring it
Perfect. And maybe we can wrap this up with sort of last two questions, and again, we could probably keep going for another hour, like you say. It's a great talk, but since we can use OKRs in pretty much any situation, you did mention some prerequisites like business agility. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, business agility really comes down to the ability for an organization to make changes based on some of the feedback they're getting, right? So what that means, if I'm an organization and my OKRs, so I set an objective, great. But if I took no feedback from the rest of my organization, maybe I'm so far removed from the actual work that I'm not actually driving any change within the organization, or that goal just does not seem reasonable to do. Maybe there's a product team sitting somewhere in the organization that's gathering feedback from clients, And our objective does not tie to that client feedback at all, because changing demographics, we can use a pandemic, partway through the year, organizations had to pivot to online, virtual, instead of being in person, right? If an organization doesn't have that business agility or the nimbleness to make pivots or changes, depending on how things are churning out, or not getting feedback from people within the organization, that really inhibits the ability for an organization to move things forward. That's why I think business agility is imperative for OKRs to be successful. Otherwise, OKRs are just not going to go anywhere. You're not going to hit any of your objectives. You're not going to hit any of your key results. And then the second piece to that is, again, OKRs also, by understanding how things are changing and whether we're moving or progressing towards our OKRs and having those conversations, we also enable business agility, because then we can pivot depending on some of these changes. I hope that answers your question, Jeff.
Yeah, no, well, not my question, but a good one.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, folks. A couple of people had questions of those. Last question that I've got for you, Nikhil. This is a tough one.
Sure.
No, it's not. A couple people have put these in a few different ways, but you talked a little bit about sandbagging earlier and people setting them too low. I'd love to know what your thoughts are about sharing OKRs with the individual performers on teams, and any impact that you could see with people trying to game them to make things look better. And in particular, I want to go one step further with that, where an organization may advocate and say, OKRs, yay, we're a team, we're going to win as a team, yet still rewards and promotes people individually. Can you make some connections through those two?
Yes. You might have to remind me of all the elements of that, but there's so much to unpack. I think the key is, like I said, that, of course, every compensation, if we look at some of the more established organizations, they're going to be directly driven by company performance to some degree. What you want to do is actually eat your, chow, if you will, because you want to tie it to that company performance and not to a performance of OKRs. Because if you tie it to a company performance, what you're saying is the outcome of your company being more successful for, gaining 10x the amount of either revenue or customers that you started your year with, and not just, I'm going to hit 100% of my OKR and I'm going to be rewarded for that. That switches that to an outcome. It also takes away the sandbag element, because I can't easily game that. I can't control whether I have, 10x the number of customers on my e-commerce platform versus something that I can control. Then I have the ability to game it. So again, OKRs are not meant to be controlled. They're meant to be influenced. I can run X, Y, and Z to be able to influence an OKR, but I can't run X, Y, and Z to control an OKR. And that's a fundamental thing that I try to impart on people. So I think I answered your sandbagging question, and I may have answered the other one too. Is there a third element that I missed from that one?
No, I think that was great, Nikhil. This was a great overview. Throw that slide back up again so we can get in touch with you again.
Sure.
And remember, folks,
Absolutely.
This is available, will be available very soon on the AgileTO YouTube channel site. So check that out when it's there. And if there are more questions that you have, or your question didn't get answered, I tried to get to most of them. Hopefully I got most of them. But it sounds like, Nikhil, you're welcome to and would enjoy having conversations continuing forward. So thank you so much for your time tonight. This was great. Folks, thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed this, got something out of it. And the AgileTO organizers, we look forward to seeing you next month, where we have another exciting topic. Stay tuned.